I'm Ruth Appelhoff, the Executive Director of Guildhall. Welcome to the first annual Hamptons Institute presented by Guildhall in collaboration with the Roosevelt Institute. A weekend-long symposium featuring leaders in their fields discussing issues currently impacting our community, our country, and the world at large. I would like to thank Mickey Strauss for spearheading this idea and recognize his efforts. Let's give him a round of applause. Thanks, Mickey. And recognize his efforts and those of Ellen Chesler in bringing all our esteemed speakers together. Thanks, Ellen. My deepest appreciation to our lead sponsor, the Tar family. A round of applause, please, and the co-sponsors. Our first panel this morning is titled Building the Infrastructure for a New Economy. It is moderated by Jeff Madrick, Roosevelt Institute Senior Fellow and author and contributor to the New York Review of Books. Please welcome Jeff Madrick.
Well, thank you. Thank you for waking up early and coming to our little event. I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our panelists, most of whom I have known for quite a while. Bernard Schwartz will be our first speaker, and as many of you know, he's currently the chairman of BLS Investments, but built the giant firm Laurel Space and Communications, the high technology company, into a Fortune 200 company over the years, I think, since the early 1970s. He's a very active political force in America. He sponsors a lot of programs at universities and think tanks. We're very grateful to have him here. He will be talking about his ideas about how the need for public investment, in particular in infrastructure. Following Bernard will be Rob Johnson, who I've gotten to know in recent years, also a very active public policy person. His government experience goes back to the Senate Budget Committee I guess it was under Pete Domenici, but I think, no, it couldn't have been under the leadership of Pete Domenici. Yes, it could have been. It was William Proxmire, actually, his main years. And he went on to become a hedge fund manager for a while. He's very active with George Soros, and in fact, leading this new effort in a search for a new economic program. And most important to us, he's a senior fellow at the Roosevelt Institute and heads the economic policy program there. Our final speaker, who I don't know very well, but we are delighted to have him here, is Van Jones. He has started 3 nonprofit organizations, largely based around environmental issues, but not entirely. Let me get this right, the Elia Baker Center for Human Rights, Color of Change, and Green for All. So obviously he has 2 major interests. His book, The Green Collar Economy, has been widely read and is widely influential, and he will talk about his ideas about energy jobs, green jobs, and so forth on this panel. So please welcome our participants. I think it's appropriate they come in now. That's a cue, folks. Yeah. I thought I was supposed to come out last, so I always bring my book bag with me. I'm going to participate a little bit in this as well, and I just wanted to take 5 minutes to set the stage for what we're going to be talking about. 'Cause I think this panel is about what America wants to be, and in fact, a little more than that. I think it's about what America needs to be. And most of the panelists, I think probably all the panelists today, believe we are on the brink of something. This is not business as usual. America has its future in its hands right now. We have lived through 30 to 35 years of an ideology that has called for the consistent limiting and restraint of the uses of government. Now, to some degree, that's always useful. To some degree, government always has to be refreshed, pruned, rethought. But it got carried to extremes. And we saw the end result of those extremes in 2008. And suddenly, we lived through a period where we believed, and mainstream economists believed, we had solved the policy problems of the economy. The great age of moderation, it was called. And that notion stuck with policymakers up until basically 2008, certainly the end of 2007. It's always good to remind ourselves that Ben Bernanke, a bright, well-meaning, and well-educated man, had no idea the subprime crisis would spread as late as July 2007, or so he said, several months after Bear Stearns already went down and had to be sold at distressed prices, and there were already calamities in the market. Only then did he begin cutting interest rates, and cutting those interest rates turned out to be not nearly enough. Fed policy wasn't working, and in the late 2008, or the second half of 2008, the economy fell. Free fall, really. The government had to step in, and most people welcomed it. We had TARP, a program I don't think, and maybe many of you don't think, was well thought out. I think we will pay a price for it. The government should have gotten a much better deal on it and had more influence over the course of the credit markets and the banking community. But the $700 billion bailout did stabilize the markets for that time. It was necessary. Had we not bailed out AIG and Citigroup in some way or other, I am not sure that we could imagine the calamity that would have followed. And then we had President Obama's stimulus program. And I want to reiterate, that stimulus program did work. That stimulus program has created jobs, has raised the GDP. I don't think it was structured very well, but, and it probably should have been larger, but it was quite a political achievement early in that administration. And we may indeed we certainly need another stimulus again. Just to clarify that, in the 6 months before that program took place, that stimulus program, the economy was falling at a 6% annual rate. GDP was falling at a 6% annual rate. We were losing jobs at roughly 650,000 a month. When that program was put into place, the GDP started growing slightly. Consumer spending came back, not because people were making more money in the private markets, but because of the increased transfers and the automatic stabilizers, and job losses were reduced in half to something in the order of 300 to 350,000 a month. It did work, but what's the outlook right now? The outlook right now is the best we can do, perhaps, is 6.5% unemployment rate in 2013 if the economy grows, if we don't have a double dip. 6.5% is more or less the worst it got in the recession of the early 2000s, and that's the best we can expect 3-4 years down the road. These are difficult times. The unemployment rate, as you know, is hovering around 10%. 9.5% will probably go to 10%. If we include part-time workers and workers who want jobs and can't get them, it's more like 16%. The shocking number to me is, while 15 million workers are unemployed at the moment, perhaps 35 million workers in 2010 will be unemployed at one time or another. 35 million, extraordinary. But having said all that, and I'll be quick after this, having said all that, our problems have been longer term than this. We have had, in my view anyway, an economy that has not been working properly for years and that we have neglected badly for years. 1% of the population has received 58% of the real income created in this economy since the mid-1970s. That's an economy that's not working. That's not a class issue. That's not a class argument or a class clash. That's simply an economy that's not working properly. Male incomes, a typical male earns less now than the typical male after inflation did in 1969. We have ignored, neglected, and I think this is what we're going to address on this panel mostly, ignored and neglected transportation infrastructure, R&D in America, environmental issues, social equality issues, business innovation, education, and healthcare. And now we face big deficits. And we have a huge argument in America about whether this government can handle those big, abiding, long-term issues. Can America really do this when it faces this large deficit? These are some of the issues we're going to address. I'll let our panelists speak now. Each will speak 10, maybe 12 minutes, present their case. I'll wrap up a little bit. I hope to maybe ask them one or two questions, but then I hope we have plenty of time to engage the audience and have a fun, interesting, provocative, and constructive back and forth. So again, thanks for waking up so early. We will start with Bernard Schwartz. Bernard, thank you for coming. Do you want to?
No, I can do it from here. Your introduction is an interesting introduction, but I would be much broader and much more severe on our system. We're not going through a difficult time in the United States. We're going through a crisis. But the crisis is a worldwide crisis. Every nation in the world, with the exception of maybe Brazil, India, Australia, New Zealand, and they're not large enough to make a big difference. Every nation in the world is cutting back on their GDP, with the exception of the United States. Even China is a reduction of about 30–40% in GDP. So we would consider 7 or 8% growth terrific. For them, it's nevertheless a cutback in terms of GDP growth. We are expanding mainly due to the stimulus that went into effect, but those stimuluses were short-term. They're not meant to be long-term. The worldwide crisis reflects the fact that we are almost on the edge of deflation. The world, our world has never been able to handle deflation very, very well. There is very little growth engines in the world outside of the United States. The distinction about America is that we have had for a very long time a growth economy that has had setbacks from time to time. We've handled those setbacks. The problem today is the perfect storm happened all at one time. And it's a reflection not of the fact that some people miscalculated about their growth investment. It happened because since 1999 and 1997, America has been embarked in a different philosophy than it had before. Starting way back in up to 1970, 1975, the amount of infrastructure investment in the United States was about 2% a year. Starting around 1975, it was reduced annually to about 2%, creating a 1% deficit in the infrastructure. And that 1% deficit is consistent with the almost $2 trillion worth of input that the engineering societies think is necessary. But in 1997 and 1999, with the change of Glass-Steagall and a continuing attitudinal change on the part of bankers, rating agencies, people who work in government who are supposed to regulate, individual business people who had some responsibility for loans that they were making to make sure they were collectible. All of that was suspended because of a system that incented people to do things wrong. Bankers became incented not to see that they were going to get repaid their loans, but to get as much out on their books as possible, because they made money and bonuses on those loans, and they packaged them and sold them to other people. Each time they packaged it, they didn't do anything to help the product that they were working on. They just increased the cost of it. And that cost became uncontrollable. Rating agencies were incented to give high ratings, irrespective of what the responsibility was. Mortgage companies were incented to take on mortgages, even though they could not be repaid, because they packaged those mortgages, added their fees, and got out of the responsibility. Everybody was responded to this, but the people who responded most badly were the people in the government who did not regulate, and the people in Wall Street who were making enormous amounts of profits. When I say the enormity of the profits, we here would not be, we're in the upper part of what our society is all about. The people in East Hampton is not Main Street. But even to us, the amount of money that was being taken out by the bankers was extraordinary. It really boggles the what we consider to be fair play. That has not changed. Today, the people who run the Wall Street houses were able to do something that has not been done in America for 250 years. For 250 years, the banking industry has tried to consolidate, to try to concentrate, eliminate competition. But they were always prevented from doing that. In 2 years, they've been able to accomplish exactly that. There's an enormous concentration of power, of wealth, of resources, but not to build up capital of those companies, not to increase the dividends to stockholders, but just to increase the pay of the people who ran those companies. This has come to a crisis, and we're trying to handle that crisis today, but I don't see a change in the personnel who is supposed to do that. If you look at the investment, the financial regulators in the government, the 4 or 5 people who really run the financial part of the government, they're the same people who were there in 1999, in 2002, in 2005, in 2007, 2009. They're still there today. The banking bill that's been pushed through Congress is supposed to be an extraordinary advantage. To change all that, nobody knows what's in it. I hope it happens, but I don't know. But I am here today to talk about something that is a program that I think can go forward in a positive way. And that is the idea of a massive, a large infrastructure program. The problem that we have today is that the Federal Reserve, if you believe them, is saying that we are going to grow in this quarter about 3 to 3.5%. That's terrific. The GDP growth of 3.5%, we would all sing in the streets. We would be dancing wildly with that kind of recovery. At the same breath, they say that with a 3.5% increase in GDP, we will not grow employment this year. We will not grow employment next year. We have somewhere between 15 million people, 19 million people unemployed. There's another 8, 9, 10 million people who are underemployed. Most of those have reached the exhaustion. They've exhausted the benefits they have from unemployment insurance. It is a jobless recovery. It is unacceptable, and we should demand some change in that circumstance. There's only one real program of size, and that is to make an investment in the infrastructure of the United States. And we're talking about infrastructure. We all feel the deficit when we ride on potholes, if you come from Beijing by plane and land in JFK, you are involved with a third world nation. It's the United States. It's not China. The elements of the infrastructure that is in far, far degradation, you're going to hear some about those a little bit later, are getting to an extreme position. We're talking about maybe a $2 trillion opportunity. That should be seen as a demand. It should be a demand for those kind of services. Not only that, but we have the resource to fill that demand, and that is our unemployed labor. The problem is one of leadership. There will not be a program that carries a multi-year effect. Only a multi-year program will work because the political leaders are concerned about a long-term situation in which we have near-term deficits. It's interesting to note that when we were told that the world was going to collapse on Monday morning if we didn't do something to save the banks, something I'm not sure I agree with. But nevertheless, if I was in that room, I would have been scared too. Nobody said, how are we going to pay for this? We went out and spent $790 million to help the banks. A year later, that was under Bush. A year later, with the stimulus package from this current administration, nobody said, how are we going to pay for that? It's going to add to debt. We can't have that. But today, when we talk about a a stimulus program. It's not an investment program that will help the infrastructure and put millions of people back to work. The question is, we can't do that unless it's revenue neutral, unless we add taxes, which is not very easy to do, or we cut unemployment and other costs, which is not very easy to do. I do not know what the tipping point, look, I don't like that. I'm a businessman who would like to get as much surplus and cash as possible. Sometimes it's necessary to make an investment. And sometimes that investment is going to take more than 1 year, and that's what we're proposing. A program of, say, $1 trillion addressed through something like Build America bonds, that the United States would take a 30% interest in the form of the federal government, in the form of tax revenue like municipal bonds or some other kind of incentive. That would cost about 30% of the total U.S. The federal participation. We're talking about a program of $350 billion over a 6-7 year period. We're talking about $60-70 billion a year that can put 7 million people back to work. That's a piddling amount compared to the numbers they're talking about, and yet there is no political leadership to go forward on it. The advantages of investing in infrastructure is not only that it's going to increase the rent rolls and the value of our of things that we hold, increase the way we live, our standard of living. It will have an enormous multiplicity of effect. There is a multiplicity of dollars. For every dollar we spend in infrastructure, there's about 1.7 million percent on top of that in additional jobs to additional service organizations and work that has to be done. So we're seeing that it's an easy thing to do. We'll be discussing, I think, other programs. All I'm suggesting is these are parallel programs. But if we don't get a program that's multiple in years, which will allow businessmen to say, I'm going to make an investment in product, in people, in R&D. If it's not a multi-year program, businessmen will not do that. So there are a lot of advantages to the kind of things that we're talking about in this program. And I think with that, I'll pass on.
Thank you very much. I think Rob Johnson is going to continue the theme along those lines. Rob?
I was recently in Portland, Oregon, and I was visiting my father, who's in a nursing home. He's a retired physician. He was a urologist. And as we sat on the porch, he said to me, this president is missing an opportunity. And I prodded him to continue, and he said, when you used to do house calls with me, and people had to pass a kidney stone, what is it that you do as a physician? And I'm thinking Demerol or something. And he says, you convince them that it's transient, that the pain they're in will be over soon. And as my wife gave birth about 14 months ago, the doula and the OBGYN that were in the room with her convinced her that this was very painful and it was just about over. They continued to convince her for about 8.5 hours. Anyway, I do believe, to use Franklin Roosevelt as a backdrop, that right now I am most afraid of fear itself. I see a tremendous amount of fear, and I take my father's perspective, and it's not really so much a criticism of the president, it's a criticism of our society, that we are indulging in fear. And there's no better example of that than the Aspen Ideas Festival that's somewhat like what we're doing here today out in Colorado, where just a couple of days ago, David Gergen and Niall Ferguson essentially fear-mongered about deficit reduction to a very powerful and elite audience. And I think following Bernard's leadership and Jeff's writing and Van's inspiration past and to come in a few minutes, we really have to resist that trend. We have to resist that indulgence in fear and get to a place where people believe that their children or themselves in a few years will do better than we are doing now. We have to convince people that this is a transient problem. And I'm quite concerned about this in one respect because I started my career, as Jeff announced, working in the Republican Party with Pete Domenici. At that time, we were resisting the Reagan tax cuts on Domenici's Republican staff, and we were accused of not being optimistic Americans. Well, people who are fearmongers now about deficit reduction and people who fearmonger about the incapacity of government to do anything that benefits our society are not acting like optimistic Americans. And I think that needs to be challenged over and over and over again. We do, unfortunately, come out of a difficult experience of the financial bailouts. While I think, as Bernard said, we went over the cliff and it was a win-win, or a less loss kind of cooperative outcome to bail out the financial sector. The unfortunate side of that episode is that the people who lobbied for relaxation of their own rules, engaged in excess and made mistakes, were the people who got paid, and the victims of those side effects are the people who did the paying. And that harms, that kind of unfairness harms trust and faith in government in the next stage to be an arbiter of fairness and balance in our society. And we're seeing that in the polls, we're seeing that at the Tea Party election energy that surrounded Scott Brown. I do think, as people spoke of last night, that the financial bill is better than nothing, but it does not even begin to correspond to the challenge that calamity created. And I don't think that is a question of blaming personalities. I think we're going to have to get at the question of campaign finance reform. This notion of fear, when I think about, we're just starting a project at the Roosevelt Institute, and the theme of which is transforming the American economy. And we start in the context of this aftermath of the bailout. We start in the context of a worn-out infrastructure that has been allowed to lag for, as you mentioned, 30 years, growing at much less than had been the prevailing trend. And as I try to map out this vision of what ingredients would constitute a transformation that gave faith to people that this would be over, I concentrate on the theme of productivity. Productivity of people 7-10 years in the future is the basis for resumed growth in their wage, compensation, and living standard. As Ban has written a great deal about energy and so forth, we are also faced with another formidable challenge, which is that we have been mispricing energy for a long time. And the side effects for the environment, people emphasize climate change, pollution, and other things, implies that if we price energy accordingly, it may spur investment in transformative technologies if we create the proper incentives, but it is a challenge to our productivity growth in the near term. Public investment, infrastructure investment, the American Society of Civil Engineers talks about $1.5 trillion of worn out infrastructure. One of the things that I'm most concerned about the stimulus program that we had, and it was helpful, as Jeff mentioned, it was necessary, is that it's not leaving us with durable, tangible benefits. It feels to people who are scared like they have just made a transfer to alleviate somebody else's fear and either left debt for their children or for themselves in the future. The benefit of durable, tangible investment is that when things, I'm quoting the New Deal now, like the Bay Bridge or the Triborough Bridge are put in place, or cultural institutions are fortified that last for 70 years, we can all point to what we paid for. And that positive reinforcement and feedback is part of restoring confidence in the capacities of the public sector. Education, public education, education not viewed as an input to production, but viewed as a fortification of a democratic process. Education where the lower classes in our society become more trusted by the elites as voters and as our participant, as effective energy in making good decisions for our society is something we haven't been investing in for 20 or 30 years. Basic science. There used to be an optimism and a faith back at the time when John Kennedy was president or Lyndon Johnson was president, and people's response in the polls to whether government was doing a good job hovered at 60% or higher. Investment in basic science, not knowing what kind of spin-offs, not knowing what kind of developments will come from that, is something that we could reinvigorate at this time. It's obvious to anyone who looks at economic history that the size and the proportion of profitability of the financial sector has to go down over time. As Paul Volcker says, he can only see one financial innovation that makes a difference, and that's the ATM machine. Now, he may be cutting it a little tight, but I do spend a lot of time. Bernard, I used to work with the Senate Banking Committee, and I have gone through the bill. I've talked with lots of people. I've worked with Michael Greenberger on derivatives. I don't find too many financiers that can explain to me why 40% of all corporate profits, or last year 34%, ought to be in the financial sector, how that helps everyone else in a cooperative, social dynamic. I think the other questions that we have to ask is we are very vigorously at this moment subsidizing too big to fail institutions. People made an effort to try to diminish that or stop that. It wasn't successful. Those institutions are very strong. But the question I ask is, there are groups called angel investors and venture capitalists. If we're going to subsidize somebody and we need to make a transformation in the structure of our economy, why isn't that segment of the capital market the one we favor relative to the preservation of the creditors, stockholders, and managements of the firms that have caused so much discomfort and harm in recent years? If we're going to talk about deficit reduction, I used to be a bond speculator, and I'm very curious right now about those who think cutting Social Security is going to calm down the bond market. First of all, the bond market's not very enraged. It's acting like the economy's slowing down. But secondly, if I'm a bond speculator and you cut a bunch of diffuse senior citizens in the future, what do I think? I think powerful groups in the military, the pharmaceutical industry, finance, and others will actually see that capacity as something they can reach into and push us back to the brink of crisis. We will only create credible deficit reduction when powerful sectors, including upper income taxation potentially, or value-added taxes, or other things are added to the mixture. That is when the bond speculator can say, we're on a different track. I guess I should come to campaign finance reform. When one looks at a healthcare bill that essentially codified a great deal of monopoly practice in pharmaceuticals, in insurance, and in other aspects of hospital and healthcare delivery, when our costs are more than double the OECD average, when the World Health Organization rates the quality of our healthcare as 38th in the world, and far below the Netherlands that pays approximately 35% of what an American pays per capita right now, there are places where we can make a difference and alleviate fears about deficit reduction. We just didn't happen to have a political system that could produce that. So campaign finance reform, whether it relates to finance or healthcare or addressing our social interests in a myriad of frontiers, is not functioning well now, and I don't believe anyone in either party would dispute that statement. Finally, as we acknowledge that we are all afraid, as we acknowledge that our system, which has the tone of crony capitalism in its interface with the government, where the sectors of finance, military, oil, and pharmaceuticals and others have often made their money in the interface with the state. We've got to free our political system from what you might call protecting the already powerful. This is a very difficult agenda. I was talking to someone about this last night, and they said, well, I feel like we're on the Titanic, and the question is, do we tell the navigator how to get away from the icebergs, or do we try to get to the safe and put the jewels in our lifeboat and get out of here? But I grew up in Detroit, and I'm always attracted to Motown music. And Martha Reeves and the Vandellas have a very famous song called Nowhere to Run and Nowhere to Hide. The United States is the leader of the world system, and we all have nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. Audiences like this, people like this, are the people who have to resist their own fears and put us back on that trajectory so that the pain does prove to be transient and not an ongoing phenomenon. Thank you.
I was waiting for you to break into a chorus of the song. Maybe at the end.
At the end, we can all do it.
Van Jones.
That's good. Well, first of all, it's good to be here. Good morning. Obviously, people who are here this early to talk about a subject like this care a great deal. Many of you are people who have, as political donors, as philanthropists, have invested your own blood, sweat, and tears in trying to avoid the decline of our country, and yet here we are on the bubble. I want to talk a little bit about some of the ideas that could actually make a tremendous difference in the short term and the long term. I think the worst part about the situation that we're in is that it's not because we don't have good ideas about how to fix it. Sometimes it seems very complicated. A lot of times it's just not. So I want to start off with a little story, since you told such a good one, about one of my favorite people in the world, Paul Hawken, who is an author. People know Paul Hawken? He wrote the Ecology of Commerce. He's an incredible ecological economist and wise, gentle. And he came to Oakland, where I've done a great deal of my work.
The schools arrange for the payment of their homes, get out of their jobs and get in retirement. They're in trouble. And they're in trouble not because we don't know what to do. You talk about energy reform, you talk about various other kinds of reforms or infrastructure. We know what to do. I've never met anybody who said he's against infrastructure. Everybody I speak to in Washington said, yeah, infrastructure is the #1 issue of the country. But they're incapacitated by the fact that in order to solve that problem, we have to increase the debt. We have to pay for it. It's interesting to note this country has never paid for the Louisiana Purchase. We never paid for the purchase of Alaska. We never paid for the Triborough Bridge. We continue to roll it over. Our debt has been increasing. There have been a few years in our history in which we have been debt-free or debt neutral. Very few years. We continue to increase our debt. We're incapacitated by that issue. I challenge anybody to say that 7% of our GDP in terms of national deficit, national expenditure, is too much. I challenge that. Who said it was 7%? Why isn't it 8%? Why isn't it 9%? Why do we stop at 7? I challenge people who say that 100% of our GDP is as much as we can afford in our total national debt. Who said that? The United States is not Greece. The United States is not California. We are the most unique country in the world, and the whole world understands that, and that's why they buy our bonds. We're the safest place to have investment. That's why they buy our bonds, not because they're trying to help us. There is nothing beneficial in the French attitude, believe me. The French don't like us, they don't like anybody. There's nothing beneficial about the Chinese. They do business with us because it's in their interest to do business with us. We should not forget who we are. Our technology is the greatest in the world, and it will continue to be the greatest in the world. Our investment in our technology, in information services, in health services, oceanography, aerospace, and discipline after discipline. The people in the world send their children to our higher education. When they're very sick, the rich people come here. There's something very unique about this country, but what we're missing is leadership. And the leadership starts here. You people are not doing, we are not doing what we should be doing. We should be saying to our representatives, I'm not going to support you because you don't make any difference. I want you to go out there and say to the deficit hawks, we're going to defeat you. We're going to make investments in what makes America strong. That's what we need today. Pardon me. And we are bound by, I understand why it's good to have an energy program, but you're talking about something that's going to benefit from America for 50 years. It'll take us 4, 5, 6 years to get there. What we have to say to the deficit hawks, I don't care if we have $1 trillion program that increases our debt. We can manage that in America. We cannot manage 14, 15, 16 people unemployed. So to answer your question, I'm optimistic that we can do this, but I really believe that what we're missing today is a political leadership that says this is what we're going to do. I'd just like to say a couple of things. If we took a poll, and I hate polls, if we took a reading of the people in this audience of who the good presidents are, you're going to mention Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman and John Kennedy. Those presidents, every one of them, took unpopular stands to do particular situations, whatever they thought was important. That's missing today in our political equation. If we do not have a definition of what our politics in the next, but between here and November, I would predict, as optimistic as I am, that we are going to go into a political crisis in which the political floundering of our administration will be reflected throughout the world. And we're going to have a very bad economic situation for several years.
Rob, would you like to talk a little bit about the political reality?
Yeah. I think it's important to start from the vantage point of the businessman. Because in a decentralized market economy, it is the businessman that controls hiring, and it's the businessman that controls whether to invest or not. And sustainable consumption derives from the decisions the businessman makes. Particularly when I talk to small or medium-sized businessmen who cannot feed off of the state. They're very concerned right now because they say, if you continue to run these deficits without any noticeable increase in social productivity, it will lead to confiscatory taxation in the future, and my profits will be diminished. On the other hand, if you cut spending now, if you follow the Niall Ferguson anxiety trajectory, I already have excess capacity.
did you work 2008 to elect the president? And how hard did you work 2009 to support him? And most people, it's a pretty big delta. People went from knocking on doors and running all over the country to munching popcorn and watching TV, ask when's he going to give another speech? And I think that there's a democracy engagement gap that we've got to deal with, number one. Number two, I agree with you that the start-stop nature of a lot of these policies, the short-term nature, is just devastating. We've got to have a long-term engagement. Even in the clean energy sector, you have start-stop tax incentives where you don't know if you're going to have the tax credits in 2 years, literally in 2 years, to finish your clean energy project. That's nuts. So those are the ways we're shooting ourselves in the foot. But I just want to point out that to this point around the deficit, and we can't spend any more money, I feel like I woke up in Malawi. I mean, do we live in Malawi? Do we live in like some third world country? It's unbelievable to me that we have now we've hypnotized ourselves and talked ourselves into this worldview of extreme scarcity so that we're willing to let our classroom sizes double in cities double from already 20 kids to 40 kids, 45 kids in schools across the country starting in the fall. You're talking about eating your seed corn. I mean, can you imagine what that's going to mean for the long term? There are places in our economy where there's plenty of money. Our big oil companies are still getting billions of dollars of subsidies for reasons that are unclear to most people. Those could be redeployed. We have military contractors who are hiding behind our soldier sacrifices and enriching themselves and gorging themselves day after day. They should be at the table in terms of where we're going to be able to get money from. I'm still confused. I'm not as enlightened as many of you here as to why these banksters have so much of our money and won't lend it out. In my neighborhood, if you had somebody like these banksters who 1 year were broke, absolutely busted broke, and then went door to door to every neighbor and got money, which is what the banksters did. We had to bail them out because they mismanaged their affairs. They're in trouble. Now they're fine. They're throwing a party at the end of the block. They've got, every imaginable, thing going on, and now it's our turn. It's for them to bail us out. And I think most Americans are absolutely outraged by the fact that we're still getting jacked up on the credit cards, that people are still getting thrown out of their homes, that our kids still can't get student loans, that our bosses can't get bridge loans, and yet the bankers don't have their money, they have our money. So until we're willing to talk about where the real money is in American society and how we actually use the real money in American society to solve the real problems of the American people, I think we are headed for a political disaster.
One of the things that you do see regarding savings right now in the United States is that people no longer believe they're getting their savings through real estate wealth accumulation. As a result, the behavior that we are seeing in the data of savings out of income has gone way, way up. The savings investment balance of the household sector is roughly 8 or 9% now from a -1.5. So I think there are very, very profound changes. You can see changes in things like deductibility of interest and other things to discourage debt that would improve net savings. There are some policy measures you could undertake. A little bit on this question of Rush Limbaugh. Rush Limbaugh validates people's anxieties. People who act in a kind of elite manner don't acknowledge those anxieties, and a large portion of the population that Arianna Huffington's writing about in her new book, which is entitled Third World America, don't feel they get any affirmation or voice about their anxieties. When I see David Axelrod last week in the New York Times, when the economics team of the Obama administration is painting pictures very similar, Christina Romer, Larry Summers, and so forth, are painting pictures very similar to what you hear on this panel. And Axelrod and Rahm Emanuel are standing up as the political guys on the record and saying, the polls say people are worried. You have what Bernard referred to as a lack of leadership. We are pandering to the state of fear rather than leading us out of fear. And Rush Limbaugh is an obstacle to that process.
Let me move to Van, Rob, to answer.
You asked how we could have something visible out of the energy policy. I think, to keep it brief, the most visible success of an energy policy will be when people can see their energy bills going down. Often when we talk about green stuff, people think you're going to have to spend more money as opposed to save more money and earn more money. And so besides all the solar farms and the wind turbines and all that kind of stuff, and people going to work with green hard hats, people actually seeing every month their own energy bills going down, their gas bills being less rather than more. That's the success we should be driving toward.
Bernard, you may have addressed the question earlier, but
I'll try to do it quickly. I'm a little bit intimidated by the questioner and his wife, who spend their whole life on the economic and political side of this country and do an enormously effective job. So what? The system is broken. That's the problem. And we need a national leader to fix that system. Now, when you say the people in Washington are concerned about the problems we're talking about, Larry Summers and Geithner, etc., they are the problem. They're the same group who were there for the last 10 years, the same group, okay? Not one person challenges their ability, and nobody in the administration challenges their attitude that debt must be handled. We must avoid, like the plague, any increase.
Oakland, we had an economic catastrophe before the economic catastrophe. So we've been dealing with this kind of stuff for a while. So Paul Hawken comes, wealthy man, successful man, big heart, and he's talking to us about how we can begin to create green jobs and ecological opportunities in Oakland. And in the room, there's a 6-year-old girl, African American, poor. You know, kids are amazing because they just make these connections in their mind way before everybody else and just cut right to the chase. And so while we're all sitting there trying to act like we understand what Paul's saying, you know, and trying to look, you know, she just looks at him, she's raised her hand, and she says, "Why are some people poor? Why are some people poor?" And Paul kind of stopped. And I think he recognized this is a very important question for this child. She, I think, seeing him was beginning to understand something about herself. And the way he chose to answer that question might influence her self-image for the rest of her life. Paul, being incredibly wise, kind of begins to prepare himself. He goes, "Well, you know, sometimes some people have a hard time finding a job or a hard time finding work." The little girl says, "Huh, well, is all the work done? Is all the work done?" No, it's not. And it's as simple as that. We have a tremendous amount of work undone in our country, from the roads to the bridges to repowering America with clean energy. A tremendous amount of work that needs to be done. Good work, worthy work. And we have all these people who need to work. So the challenge is very simple. How do we connect the people who most need work to the work that most needs to be done and begin to pull America back together and put America back to work? It's very simple and straightforward. And on one issue in particular, this issue of how are we going to power our country, the answers are just blatantly obvious. With 3 simple policy tools, we could put probably 1.5 million people to work over the next 2 to 3 years and make a difference in the actual unemployment. What are those policy tools? Well, it's fairly straightforward. You were talking about infrastructure, and there's been a lot of talk about the need for an infrastructure bank. Well, one subset of that conversation is the idea of something called the CEDA, a Clean Energy Development Agency, a green bank. Now, why would it be good for us to have a green bank? Well, first of all, everybody's concerned about deficits, and I'm on the side of, let's actually grow the economy and grow our way out of the deficit later. But fine, if you want to be a fearmonger on the deficit, fine. We could create a green bank right now that would actually be a profitable going concern, but begin to target money into those parts of the economy that we desperately need to grow, like clean transportation, smart grid, et cetera. You have a green bank. It doesn't cost you a bunch of money, you can make money. Number 2, You can put a price on carbon. Everybody talks about, cap and trade, et cetera, and that's not very good marketing. My heart doesn't flutter when I hear the word cap and trade. It's like it doesn't exactly sing as marketing. But at the end of the day, it's basically saying nobody gets to pollute for free in America anymore. Right? You put a price on carbon, suddenly the clean stuff looks a little bit better. You get a $20 billion reduction in the deficit, according to CBO, just by doing that. But you also create incentives for people to invest in new stuff. And then the last piece is just having a renewable energy standard. Now, a renewable energy standard is a funny word for saying we actually want to have some goals for our country. How much of the Saudi Arabia of wind power in our country do we want to capture and use to power America? How much of the Saudi Arabia of solar energy in our country do we want to capture and power America? If you have a green bank, which is a financing mechanism, you have a price on carbon, which creates some incentives to move in another direction, and you have some clearly stated goals, you certainly got enough market certainty to have a real game here and begin to put people back to work. Now, who cares? What difference would that actually make for real people? Because at the end of the day, you got a lot of people who, at this point, as you say, are going into not only fear mode, but fear and hate mode. You cannot have a country, by the way, successfully solving problems when the country is getting ethnically more diverse, but economically less prosperous. Right? You're getting ethnically more diverse, but economically less prosperous. That's a recipe for a battleground, not a common ground. Okay? And in those kinds of scenarios, people begin to not only fear, but to hate. So the way you fix that, if you aren't trying to figure out some way to seal off America and pretend we're never going to look any different than we look, is you figure out some way to become more prosperous. That's the goal. Because if you can begin to grow the economy again, you get to be one country again. If you put America back to work, you can pull America back together. Simple as that. So it makes a tremendous difference if we have economic ideas that can actually help the person who's looking in the want ads or looking on Craigslist right now. I think we got Craig here somewhere, looking for a job. Well, if you had sane and energy policy, let me tell you what you get for those working folks who right now don't know whether they should be supporting the president or joining some hate movement. You got a worker sitting there right now in Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, some of the most highly skilled workers in the history of the world. Don't let anybody tell you that we got these union guys, these lazy union folks over there in the Rust Belt. There's nothing wrong with those workers. First of all, they make cars.
Of Americans owned land in colonial and early America, an extraordinary proportion compared to the old world. We used government time and again in American history, and not obviously. There was always controversy. Nobody knew in 1780 we needed lots of canals by the early 1800s to make a commercial economy work. The states, led by New York, financed those canals, not General Electric. The states financed those canals, beginning in the early 1800s. We knew we needed a public education system. One of the most extraordinary achievements in American history was the development of primary and secondary education. By 1850, America, only 60 years after the Constitution was signed, America was spending more per pupil than France and as much as Prussia at the time, Germany, on education, and had as high or higher proportion of young kids enrolled in schools. What an achievement. Through state and local governments it occurred. One of the things we forget is health care, and I'm going to go through this very quickly. In the late 1800s, government created a healthy America and made cities possible through sanitation. By 1915, 2/3 of Americans in big cities could count on drinking clean water. An extraordinary achievement. And that the development of big cities was a source of economic growth. It gets repeated time and again. In the early 1900s, we created high schools. High schools weren't built by the Native Americans, and we just took them over. We decided to create high schools in the early 1900s. By 1930, 10% of women graduated high school. In 1910, in 20 years, 50% graduated high school. The proportions were similarly expansive for men starting at a higher level. Another extraordinary achievement, and you're all familiar with the development of the highways and the public investment in health and so forth. Government has been an integral part. To even say it's a partner in economic development misstates the issue. It's like a marriage. There is no marriage if there is not two partners in that marriage, so to speak. There is no economy without government. It's been an integral part of this all along. There were rules, regulations, donations of land to build the railroads, and people did not go to economists at Harvard or the University of Chicago and say, as Bernard was alluding to, and say, what is the social return on these canals before we invest in them? My gosh, what are we doing here? What's the social return on a primary education system? Nobody calculated it. We knew we had to do it. In fact, in retrospect, some people have calculated the social returns on that health investment in the cities at 150%. Always, one has to be skeptical about these kinds of calculations. Trust in government failed us in the last 30 years. And I just want to end. I was going to give a bunch at Challenge Magazine, a magazine I edit, we just put together a bunch of survey results about the American people. There's a lot of anti-incumbency in the land, as you know. 26% of people say they may not vote for their congressman this year. I mean, only 26% say they will vote for their congressman this year, definitely. They are looking around. Anti-incumbency is, needless to say, bad for the Democratic Party. On the other hand, Americans are angry at every institution in the nation. Americans are generally angry, and they don't, according to the polls, think Republicans will do better than Democrats or Democrats better than Republicans. That's the state of affairs we face in 2010. But one number historically sticks out to me, and then I would like to go back to the panel. In the Kennedy-Johnson years, surveys suggest that 68% of people on average greatly trusted or moderately trusted government. 68% in those years on average. By the Carter years, 10 years later, after unemployment, very high inflation, very difficult years, the high oil prices and so forth, only 29% trusted government. It rose only as high as 40%, even in the popular years of Ronald Reagan and some of the other presidents. During George W. Bush's term, it gradually declined to 25%. And sadly, most sadly for me, trust in government in the Obama year and a half has declined further to something like 22%. A lot of that has to do with the economy and crisis after crisis. But that's the situation we now face. To me, the most distressing. So I'd like to ask the panel, you guys deal in the real world. Starting with Bernard, is there a chance politically to get some of this done that all three of you are talking about?
I'm adversarial. I've been a Democrat all my life. I really believe in investing in parties. I like a two-party system. I wish we had a stronger Republican Party, but we don't. We don't have a very strong Democratic Party. The crisis that we are right now, we're in right now, is that we have two Americas. We have Main Street on one hand, and we have Wall Street, Washington on the other. I spend a lot of time in Washington. They do not know what's happening in the world. I spend a lot of time in Wall Street. They don't care what's happening in the world. The real problem is that you've got Main Street, who is struggling on a daily basis to pay their mortgages, send their kids in a national deficit. That's their attitude. And you know what? It's business as usual in Wall Street. You think this bill that has been introduced is going to make some changes? Nonsense. They will work around that as easily as pie because there's nobody in Washington who says, I'm going to crack your knuckles. I want you to get us out of this thing. I'm not going to allow you to take deposits from American people at 1% and 2% and speculate with those deposits. We need Glass-Steagall back. We need a leadership. We need a leadership that says, my program may not work, and if it doesn't work, we'll fix it. But we're going to make changes, and these are the changes we can make, but does not take a poll to see if it's popular. Roosevelt never took a poll.
Bernard, let me try to get in a few more questions.
You go to Washington, and it's dead on arrival. I've spoken to our national leadership about, unfortunately, I only speak of the Democrats, not the Republicans, but every one of them has said, yeah, you're talking about a capital budget. I said, yes, I'm talking about a capital budget. I'm not going to back, my constituencies will not back it. It's too complex. It's too hard to understand. What we do need is every business in America has a capital budget. Every state in America has a capital budget. Only the federal government doesn't have a federal, and why not? If you were the chairman of the Transportation Committee in Congress, you don't want somebody telling you what to do. You own transportation. If you're the head of the Energy Committee in Congress, you own energy. You don't want a national budget. It's a political problem. So what I'm suggesting that we get around a non-starter, which is having a capital budget, and having a capital budget by having deficits. It's the only way we're going to be able to work our way out of this problem. We have a broken system. You and we have to go, I mean, there are so many good ideas out there. I'm not interested in ideas. I'm interested in getting 7 million people to work this year. If it's wrong, it'll get 4 million people to work it this year. So what? Let's try to do it.
Rob?
On the question of fear-mongering, I think at this point we need a large number of people to validate visions, ideas that, as Bernard said, there are many good ideas, and there has to be, what you might say, a coalition of leading people pushing for those ideas that appeal to a broad spectrum of America because they see how they win in the picture. The second thing has more to do with what I'll call messaging tactics and techniques. If one watches the BBC documentary that's in 4 parts by Adam Curtis, you can find it online at like Google Video. It's called The Century of the Self. It's about the use of psychological messaging techniques, media techniques, of repetition, simple talking points, and so forth. Unfortunately, the far right has done a much better job in that regard than progressives have. People are convinced, not necessarily by the imagination of the idea, but by the repetition and by the notion that it seems to come from multiple places. On the right, they do a very good job of appearing like 40 independent voices agree to the same thing. They're all sharing the same talking points. But I do believe that the process of messaging, what you might call the psychology of marketing, is something that needs to be improved so that good ideas become more convincing and address the problems of real people. Finally, I think we need probably a constitutional amendment in the aftermath of the Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission campaign, which changes the role of money relative to people and votes in our society and decision making. Otherwise, we won't have a great deal of credibility with anything we try to do.
Van, question and some final comments?
Just to really underscore the point, you asked a question about public housing projects, that kind of stuff. The question is, where do solutions come from? Where do real solutions in our country come from? And President Obama, when he was a candidate, said, change comes to DC, not from DC. And I think that's just as true now. We have places like Cleveland, Ohio, where people have finally gotten together. You have labor unions fighting and the crime off the charts and nobody working together. They got together, they said, we're gonna create real green solutions here. They involve the public housing projects folks, but they also involve the business community, Chamber of Commerce, the local banks, a huge local foundation, and they're bringing that city back. There's some federal dollars there, but not a lot. And yet the example of that city finally coming together and solving its problems in the midst of all this stuff is going to begin to spread. So I think what we've got to understand is there's a relationship. I think we do this president a huge disservice. I worked for him. I know what it's like to be in the White House when you are the center of everybody's communications act. It's white noise at the end of the day. The whole world telling you what you should do, what you should think. Why didn't you say this? Why didn't you say that? It just becomes white noise. What cuts through are actual success stories. People actually implementing these values at city and state level so the president has something to point to and build off of. And we have the ability to do that right now. We can't write speeches for the president. We spend too much time talking about what the president should do and what the president should say. He's one person. But we can have tremendous positive impact at the local level and begin to once again aggregate all of those hopes and all of those energies that then let the political leadership actually do the right thing.
Thank you, Van. One quick point on the consumption binge. I've got to make this. I'd be very careful about talking about a consumption binge in America. The middle 3 quintiles in America did not increase their consumption levels over previous periods. In an age of low wages and no wage increases, people borrowed to keep their heads above water, to get decent education, to make sure they could pay health care bills, to pay the extra cost because their spouses had to go to work. I'm taking a moderator's prerogative in making that final point. Thank you all for your patience. Thank the panel very much.
The Roosevelt Institute has partnered with the Guildhall organization, and this Hamptons Institute is the result of that. And I'm with Andrew Rich, who's the president of the Roosevelt Institute. And this has been some heady weekend of seminars.
No, it's been a phenomenal weekend. You know, we had this phenomenal opportunity to partner with Guildhall to bring to the Hamptons a discussion of ideas, some of the major policy debates of this moment, and frankly, some of the debates around sort of how our politics should look as we go forward. And for us, it's been a great opportunity.
The concept, Andrew, there have been different institutes. Everyone knows of the Aspen Institute and these other think tanks, but this is a seminar that brings some of the greatest minds in the world of arts, business, communications, if I'm leaving out anything.
Politics,
exactly.
And education, yeah. No, it's modeled in some ways after the Aspen Ideas Festival, which is a 7 or 8 day festival out in Aspen, Colorado. But it's one that is designed really especially for the Hamptons in 2 respects. One, it's taking advantage of a lot of the talent that is actually out here during the summer. You know, I mean, an awful lot of the panelists are people who spend their summers here. They're here to relax, to enjoy one another, but they in fact are people with enormous intellect, and it's wonderful to bring them together for this community to have an exchange of ideas, and that makes it different from Aspen. And then second, this partnership is with us at the Roosevelt Institute, and the Roosevelt Institute's we're the nonprofit partner to the FDR Presidential Library up in Hyde Park, New York, and we're devoted to carrying forward the spirit and the values that Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt brought to this country. And we believe that one way to do that is to encourage a debate of ideas and to bring thought leaders together for that purpose. And so, again, this has been as good an environment for that as we could have hoped for.
It's interesting. Eleanor Roosevelt was a reporter.
Yes.
And FDR, known for his fireside chats, which brought politics, government to people's living rooms. You're an extension of all of that.
No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, they believe, and the Roosevelt administration back in the 30s during the Depression, a period not, a little worse than perhaps today, but where we were experiencing economic downturn, depression, fear, and concern, was one where he actually created the first brain trust, and he brought a lot of thought leaders together, and he brought people with diverse points of view to debate ideas in front of him and in the administration in order for him to figure out the way forward for this country and for the world. And again, I think that's really very much a model for what this can be. This was the first opportunity we had to do it. But we hope to make it something we do on a regular basis. I think this community responded well to it and is ready-made for it.
Well, we're looking forward to the Roosevelt Institute partnering with Guildhall for years to come, and for this to extend for very many years to come.
Thanks.
One question: these are very difficult times in terms of the economy, and when you talk of FDR, he led us through the Great Depression, and all of those were the worst of times. Are you hopeful about where we're going as a country and as a nation?
Yeah, I am hopeful. I mean, we as a people are a very resilient population. We are an enormously inclusive population. But we're at a point where I think we have lost sight of what the proper balance between a thriving democracy and a thriving economy, where that balance is, and and I think we're coming to terms with that right now. We're coming to terms with what it would mean for our democracy to be a bit more vibrant, and by that, making government a bit more vibrant and doing the good work for the American people that, frankly, we saw a function of the New Deal back during the Roosevelt presidency. And I think there's an awful lot of people discouraged right now about where are the jobs going to come from, how are they going to hold on to their homes. The conversations we've had over the course of this weekend, I think, suggest that there's hope, there's optimism, but it's going to take serious leadership, and it's going to take making some people probably a little angry along the way and getting through some fights and some difficult conversations. I think the country is up for it, and I think it's going to be what we can look forward to for about the next year.
If our viewers are interested in knowing more about the Roosevelt Institute, how can they find out?
We'd love for them to come to find out more about us. We're based in New York City, offices in Washington and up in Hyde Park, and our website address is www.rooseveltinstitute.org.
Look forward to seeing you next year.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.